So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha. Now, before we start, I just have to warn everybody that my voice is not as good as Bhante. He has this really beautiful chanting voice, so sometimes my voice actually cracks when I try to do his chants, so just be warned. But the intention is the most important thing. Okay. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So nice to see everybody again here today. And sometimes when Bhante is away, he asks me to fill in. So I think this is maybe the 10th or something time I filled in. And so I'm a substitute teacher. So I remember what I would do to substitute teachers when I was young. So I didn't find any tacks on my seat or anything like this. So this is a good thing. So I've been back in Canada now for a couple of weeks, and it's been quite lovely. Canadian culture and Sri Lankan culture can be very different. And interestingly enough, I thought that I would come here and just be having all this free time. So actually there's a senior monk who asked me to write an article, and I said, yeah, I can write it. I'll write it fast because I'm going to have all this free time in Canada. But I came here and I've just been very busy actually, kind of going from one thing to the other. So today I had a Dhamma and met with some old friends and had a long Dhamma discussion. And then on the way here I had to drop off some keys at the Mahavihar, and I had a Dhamma discussion with Bhante. And then I came here, now doing this Dhamma talk. So it was a very interesting principle in the Buddha's teaching, a very kind of interesting thing, and that what we tend to seek for in our lives in the West is we seek for this kind of fame, right? Kind of what really matters, not all the time, but it's one of the things that drives people. I remember when I was young, we think about who are the real heroes of Western culture. It's people who tend to change the culture in this really amazing way. Actually, they sometimes come up with really great inventions, but also their success, the measure of their success is that they're not just remembered in this generation, like not just by people who were alive at that time, but they're remembered for generations afterwards and afterwards and afterwards. People still remember these people. They're still kind of very well regarded. This is seen as something very, very successful, very, very excellent. And it's almost to the extent that if you can't do that, then like, what are you doing with your life, right? Yeah. I was reading this book. There's this fellow I've been trying to understand a bit about Sinhalese culture, because Sinhalese culture and North American culture have these very big differences to them. I mean, there's overlap to be sure, but me having grown up here, going to Sri Lanka, trying to adapt myself. How do I live in this culture in a way that's respectful, and also in a way that I don't lose the good things from my culture? So there's this one fellow I was reading about, and he has this whole book on body language, this universality of body language. All humans display certain cues in their faces and their bodies, depending on the emotions they're feeling. So I felt very happy about reading this. At least I can figure out to a certain extent what's going on. But one of the interesting things was that this fellow, he has several books. So I started trying to read more to he's like a researcher into human behavior. And these are things that are mentioned in the Pali Canon, but very briefly. The Buddha just says, when you approach this assembly, you should use the speech that's appropriate for that assembly. If you approach this other assembly, you should use the speech that's appropriate for them. You should adopt their mannerisms, adopt their way of speaking in such a way that they can understand what you're saying. But exactly how to do that, like many things in the Pali Canon, there's this category. And then exactly how to do that, the details have to be worked out on one's own to a certain extent. So anyways, this fellow, he's this researcher into human behavior and has many of these kind of details. He's very famous now, and I think he's been on a lot of talk shows and these kind of things. So even I heard about him in Sri Lanka, which shows how famous he is. And reading through some of his books, I wanted to find out about human behavior, but one of the themes that he's talking about sometimes is he's like, how many people here want to be mediocre? You get these like, before I was a monk, I was a business student. You kind of listen to these motivational speakers who are like, unleash the giant within you and become this really great person, right? So he does this thing like, how many people here really want to be just mediocre? Who wants to just be mediocre? And I was thinking, well, I don't mind. Being a little bit mediocre, what's the problem with that? Being mediocre, it's not a big deal. But what this shows is that nobody raised their hand in the audience and was like, I want to be mediocre. Everybody wants to be somebody really, really exceptional. This really exceptional person. A person of exceptional qualities who other people look up to, right? Who other people revere, right? This is the measure, this is one of the great measures of the biggest figures in Western history, this impact that they had that lasts generations and generations and generations and generations. Now, who wants to be like that, right? Probably most people, or many people in his audience anyways. So one of the interesting things about the Buddha's teachings is that the Buddha has this teaching. He says, the path to gains and offerings and fame leads one way, and the path to Nibbana leads another way. So he says, knowing this, the wise person, the disciple of the awakened one, should put aside gains, offerings, and fame, and should cultivate solitude instead. Now it's this very interesting way of wording. Should cultivate solitude instead. So I remember when I was a young man, actually, another thing is these high school kids sometimes come to the temples, these high school classes. And so I try to talk to them and relate to them, because I went to high school here. By the way, high school kids, they change like every 3 or 4 years. So the way that high school kids were 4 years ago sometimes totally changes after 4 years. So the same stories you're telling 4 years ago, they really like them. Next 4 years, it's like a whole new class or whatever, a whole new culture in high school, and you have to come up with this new way of relating to these kids. So in any event, one of the things that I remember from my time in high school is that you had these words, right? You had like people who are popular. This was the really important thing when I was in high school. And I think they've even come out with films about it, right? These films called like Mean Girls. And when I was young, they had Mean Girls #1. I think maybe they're on Mean Girls 4 by now, or 5. But in any event, it was actually a real thing. Right? Anybody who's gone to high school in Canada or the United States, that's real. And it depicts something very, very real and very, very important when you're in high school. This very small group of people who are often very beautiful and very popular, many people know about them, they wield this immense power. And if they wield it wrongly, they're really mean. It sometimes traumatizes people for a really long time. But the important thing is that in high school, this is what people crave. They crave this kind of popularity. They want to be well known. They want to be well established. They want to be invited to the best parties, right? They want people to recognize them and know who they are. And this is actually something that has quite a lot of power. It has quite a lot of cachet in the Western world. So you might say, in Western culture, where we have this kind of desire, this kind of elevation of fame. And fame is part and parcel of how many people know who you are. How many people highly regard you, right? How many people think you're really, really great? Because that affects what your life is like, right? If I walk down the street in Mississauga, everybody thinks I'm really great, then my life is a lot easier. By the way, I went to the Bahrain airport, and people did not think I was great there. So that has an effect, actually. I was kind of scared there. I got stopped at every search point and detained, and they were kind of checking me for bombs, and I was like, whoa, I'm just transiting planes. So in any event, the way that people perceive us actually has an effect on our life. But the main thing about this thing that people are searching for is it's all relying on other people. It relies on other people's perception of us. It relies on the way that other people treat us. And it relies on the way that other people's perceptions of us are over generations. The people who are super successful are the people who are really loved, not just now, but generations into the future. So the interesting thing is that the Buddha says the wise person, the disciple of the awakened one, puts aside gains, offerings, and fame, and cultivates solitude instead. This is something really interesting. Actually, in prison, if you go to prison, hopefully nobody ends up in prison, but if you watch movies about prison, you can say it that way. A person watches movies about prison. The worst place you can go in prison is the hole. I don't know if anybody's heard this term. And what the hole is it's usually this cell that has very little sunlight, and you're left there alone, with nobody else there around you. This is torture for people. This is something that they do to torture the most hardened criminals. They leave them by themselves. They leave them alone. Right? So the question then is, if this is something that everybody desires, we desire popularity, we desire fame, who wants to be mediocre? Raise your hand. I don't mind. Desire these kind of things. Then why would the Buddha say that the wise one, a disciple of the awakened, cultivates solitude instead? So this week it's been interesting. I've actually gone to 2 different funerals in the course of this week. And at these funerals, the themes that you end up touching on tend to be the same. Right? I mean, different people. I mean, you don't give the same talk. Everybody's circumstances are different. The way that one person passed away is not the same that another person passed away. The way that one person lived their life is not the same way that another person lived their life. So the talks that you give are different. But there's always a theme that you're looking for when you ask people, like, what was your spouse or your husband, what this person who passed away, what was their life like? You know, how did they live? And then you ask them, well, how did they die? What was their death like? Did they die peacefully? Did they have a lot of pain? Were they worried? What was their death like? Because this influences the talk that you're going to give to the family. Right? The people who have had relatives, they can tell when they pass away, they're very shaky. It affects their mind. It affects the mind of people around them. Now, the interesting thing is that the things that people really, really desire in their life, I was actually just talking about this today with this Dhamma discussion group. The things that people really, really desire in their life, they're these things that have this powerful impression on a person's senses. They have a powerful impression on their eyes, right? Very beautiful music has a powerful impression on our ears. There could be these very beautiful touches if somebody has like a really comfortable mattress or like some nice sheets. Actually, that can be very pleasant. Or you can have very beautiful taste. You have this really delicious meal. That was actually one of the questions that came up at this Dhamma discussion. Now, all of these things, all of these external things, they have a pattern to them. And it's a pattern we can observe. We're not left in the dark. We have this power of observation. We can see what the cause and effect is. So one of the things with these external things, one person asked me today, they're like, what do monks do to overcome their desire for food? As you go on Pindapad in Sri Lanka, you get all this different food every day. You don't get the same thing every single day. You can't choose. So what do you do if you're really, really craving for chocolate? That's what this person said. So I got the impression they like chocolate. In any event, what I said was, so the Buddha gives different meditation topics, but one of the really interesting things about food is that a food that a person really desires, they're thinking about it, they're building it up. Oh, I want that chocolate. Can't wait to get that chocolate. And they're getting more and more hungry. I want this chocolate, this chocolate. They get the chocolate, they're about to bite into the bar, there's all this anticipation, and when they bite into the bar, what happens? Their mind is gone. It's actually not on the taste of the chocolate. Their anticipation was building for this chocolate the whole time. And when they get it, they bite into it, but their mind is gone. It doesn't have any worries for a little while. It's thinking about the past, it's thinking about the future, but there's a sense stimulus that's so powerful that they don't have worries for a short period of time. For the time that they're eating this chocolate, a few seconds, at least for the time that their hunger lasts. But if you turn this on its head, next time you're really, really hungry and craving for something, watch what happens when you take your first bite instead. Instead of letting the mind go out, watch the taste of the chocolate. What's it taste like? It's nothing much, actually. It's just salty. You can taste some kind of sweetness. It's there if you just focus on the taste buds of your tongue. Right? Then look down at your stomach, your first bite. It's not full. It's still pain in your stomach in the first bite of food. But that first bite of food is the most pleasant bite. And it's because of the mind. It's because the mind is gone. It's just away. It has nothing to worry about for 3, 4, 5, 10 seconds, a minute maybe. Now this is a principle that we can observe. So the Buddha makes this statement. He says, you should make a true inference. A true inference means that there's patterns in the way that our life works, and we have to have a purpose to seeing those patterns. So one of the interesting things about people at the time that they die, I'll just kind of go over some of these funeral things, is that there's a pattern to it. Some people, when they die, I actually went down to my relative's house, and one of my relative's friends, they work in hospice care. So as a monk, you're naturally curious. You're like, what are people like when they die? What's happening when they die? What do they want to do? Do you notice a difference between some people and other people? And what they said to me was something really, really interesting. They said, most people at the time of their death don't want to be there. They're afraid of the pain, and they want to take as many drugs as they can. So at the time when they're actually dying, they're just gone. They have no idea what's happening. Now this is actually not the best way to die. It's not the most inspiring way to die, kind of dying like confused like this. But this is what people want. Now there's a pattern to this. The pattern is this. If a person lives their life searching for happiness in distraction, then they build a character that seeks happiness in distraction. But the problem with this distraction is that it never, ever, ever lasts. There's nothing we can do to make it last. Actually, there's a booby trap built into these external things. If you take one bite of the chocolate, you're really, really distracted. If you take your next bite, you're less distracted. Your third and fourth bite, less and less distracted. If you eat 3 or 4 chocolate bars, you start feeling sick. This is the way that all external sensual pleasures graph. It's a pattern. We can observe it for ourselves. So this is a pattern that leaves no freedom for a person, or much less freedom for a person. So I remember when I was a young man, I used to be addicted to marijuana. And now marijuana is legal, so in those days it wasn't legal. I was reading this board on the way here. And it was like, searching for participants in a drug study. And it's like, we're looking for heavy cannabis users who don't have any drug addictions. I was like, wait a minute, in my day, cannabis was a drug. In any event. In those days, I was addicted to it. And it was to the extent that I couldn't go to a movie without smoking weed. I felt like it was a waste of my money. It's like, if I'm going to go see a movie, I have to smoke weed before, otherwise it's a waste of my money. I'm not going to have a good enough time. Now this is another graph of these external sensual pleasures. For a person who puts the weight of their life on something external, they can't go without that thing. Whenever they get further away from that thing, their mind starts to shake. They become frightened. And because the pleasure that it gives is so, so short, they always have to search. They're always on the next search for the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. But they never, ever, ever get it. This is the way it is with all sensual pleasures. So I remember I had one fellow at the end of the session last night, he was asking me, he's like, what do you do to make your mind stable with the breath? And where the discussion went was, if you have all your weight on these external sensual pleasures, whenever you go away from them, your mind will shake, whatever it is. If a person's used to being really popular because they're physically attractive, the slightest wrinkle in their face will cause anxiety, a lot of fear. By the way, just as a funny side story, I met this monk in Thailand and we were talking, and he said, so, what do you do in your lay life? And he said, I was Claudia Schiffer's manager. So for those of you who are in the same age group as me, Claudia Schiffer was one of the most famous supermodels. And so what he said about her was I shouldn't say this, what he said about models in general, I think he was a very wealthy man. He said they're always so worried about their appearance. If your job, if your life, if all of people's way that they interact with you is based on this, of course you're going to be worried if it falls away. If your whole life is based on your spouse, on your husband or wife, right? There's people like this. I knew one person, they couldn't go 3 days away without their spouse. Like they couldn't go on a vacation for a week without their spouse, because we call it love, but their life rested on their spouse. And so anything without their spouse, their mind started to shake. Now, all of these things graph the same way. Whatever it is that's external to us that we search for happiness in, it graphs this way. It graphs this way in that it gives us this happiness for a short time. What it is actually is not a happiness. It's the happiness of distraction. It's the lack of worry that comes from this overwhelming stimulus that shuts our eyes. It shuts our eyes to what we're really looking for. Do we really want the taste? Do we really want the chocolate bar? If that's what we want, why is our mind gone when we're searching for it? So there's a trick here. There's a trick that's being played in people's minds, and there's a pattern that we can recognize. And this pattern is for a purpose. So when a person spends their life looking for happiness in this way, at the end of their life, they don't want to be there. But this isn't the end of the story. I actually asked my family friend who worked in hospice, I was like, is there anybody who has like a really good death, who seems really peaceful when they pass away? And she said, yeah. There was this one Italian gentleman, and she said, he was just there in the morning, and we wanted to give him this medication. And he said, it's okay, I don't want my medication today. And they went away for a few minutes or an hour or something. They came back, he had passed away. He's kind of just very smoothly passed away. Now, one of the things that makes people want to distract themselves is that we're all looking for happiness. But because we like these things so much, we don't want to see just how limited the happiness we get from them is. If we really like chocolate bars, people get offended if you talk badly about chocolate bars, right? We really like a person, we get offended and angry if somebody really talks badly about a person. And actually, there's no need to kind of go along talking about these kind of things if there was no other alternative. But the fact is that there is another alternative. There is a way that we can practice. There is a way that we can live in such a way that we don't need to distract ourselves. We don't need to blot our minds out. Actually, there's a way that we can live that our present moment will become more and more happy. That just being here now is something that we can be happy with. We can be content with, and we can be at ease with. Now this goes in a different direction from distraction. This goes in a direction of being present. And to make the present moment good, we have to have a mind that's beautiful. Now, a beautiful mind here doesn't mean somebody who can do a really long math equation, right? Kind of this movie, The Beautiful Mind, somebody did like really long math equations and came up with this theory of a competition or something. That's not a beautiful mind in the Buddhist teachings, although it's something really neat. He had a lot of skill. A beautiful mind is something, it's a mind that we can be comfortable sitting with. We can be comfortable when there's nothing there except our mind. So this is what people fear at the end of their life. They fear what it's like to be alone, because when you're alone, all that you've got there is your mind. That's all that's left. And if you haven't trained it well, you can go crazy. So if you're a hardened criminal, you've done all these evil things in your life and you get sent in the hole, what's going through your head? Right? The things that spin through your head are very, very uncomfortable. Right? You want to distract from that. You want a TV show. You want something to distract from that. But if we live a life where we're moral, if we live a life where we're generous, if we live a life where we practice meditation, we can turn the tables. We can turn this phenomenon on its head. This is one of the advantages of Buddhist teaching. So one of these high school students in this high school group, actually it's really interesting. In previous years, high school students, they like to hear like stories about your time in high school. You kind of relate to them. These days, actually, high school kids like to meditate. I was really surprised at that. They're like, yeah, we got the app, and it's kind of less stressful. Has anybody meditated? Yeah, we got the app, and why do you meditate? Oh, we want to be less stressed. So they were actually really, really good meditators. I was thinking to only do it for 10 minutes, and we did it the last 15 minutes of the class. These kids were just kind of sitting there, not moving. So at the end of that session, I asked if there was any questions. And actually, that's when you could tell that these kids were engaged, they were interested. And one kid put his hand up, and he said, you know, at the end of this meditation session, I had this incredible feeling, I have this feeling of refreshment. Is that supposed to happen? And I said, yeah, it's supposed to happen. That's very good. This is a sign, right? Now, one of the reasons that we don't see what we're looking for, we don't find what we're looking for, is because oftentimes people don't have a context to place their questions in. They don't have a context, a framework in their mind to place their questions in. So if it's like this, then we run from one thing to the next, right? We run from one house to the next, one job to the next, sometimes one person to the next. And we don't know why we're doing it. We don't know what we're looking for. And then at the end of our life, we're like, what was the point of all that? So after one of these funerals, there was one very old gentleman, and he said, you know, my friends, they had these silver stars, they had these bronze stars, they had all these awards, and at the end of their life, it didn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything to them. So the context that we can have, so that we don't have to feel depressed, right, that there's these patterns, and so that our search can have meaning, is that there's a very, very simple principle that guides all of our lives here, whether we know it or not. That principle applies to all of us without exception. Not just us here, to people in Sri Lanka, to people in the United States, even to little ants on the sidewalk. This principle applies. And it's a very simple one. It's that all beings want to be happy, and they don't want to suffer. This is the principle. So this, actually, the search for happiness, this is behind whatever we do. That's behind whatever we strive for. It's behind all of our desires. We want to be happy, and we don't want to suffer. Right? That's what we want. But without this context in mind, if we don't make this clear, then we just run from one thing to another without evaluating, is this really making me happy? How happy does this really make me? Now, this is not to say that everybody here has to become a monk, right? To kind of just give up everything and become a monk. But what it means is that there's ways that we can live our life that have a pattern to them. They make our mind beautiful. They make the present moment beautiful. And they make our life a good place to be. What that means is that we have resilience. One of the things that makes people's minds shake is that when all of their weight is on something else, if that thing goes away, then they've lost everything. They feel very frightened about that. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can have a type of happiness that doesn't depend on external things. And if we have that type of happiness, then we don't have to be afraid when external things go away. So when we practice morality, we don't drink alcohol, we don't tell lies, we don't steal, we don't kill anything, even ants. This kind of restraint changes the way that we live. It changes the way that we interact with the world, and it changes our mind. Actually, if we start doing these things, all of a sudden, sometimes the people we were hanging out with don't want to hang out with us that much anymore. Maybe a little bit, we can still hang out. I remember when I stopped smoking marijuana, actually, all of my friends, all of our life revolved around smoking marijuana, right? So we were still friends. We still, actually, I probably will see them during this trip, some of these people. They were kind of very kind to me. Actually, one of them even saved my life once. So I'll still see them. But just gradually, our interactions fell away. They kind of got less and less and less. So what that means is that if we keep these kind of precepts, if we start to become more and more moral, more and more generous, it will pull us away to a certain extent from external things. So you don't have to become a monk. If we keep the precepts, if we practice generosity, what we find is that our life will not be 100% in the world, but it will not be 100% out of the world, right? You'll be a lay person, but you'll also be somewhat detached. Not 100% there, not 100% gone. because some of your weight will be placed on your own mind. Now, this is one of the things. If a person trains their mind well, then at the end of their life, they're a peaceful person. They pass away well. And during their life, there's something about people who don't require anything. Something about people who have peace that doesn't depend on external things, that influences the people around them. Actually, when the Buddha's first disciple is one with the most wisdom, Venerable Sariputta, when he got converted to Buddhism, it was just by a monk walking on alms. All he did was see a monk walking on alms. And he thought, surely the path to the deathless has been found. Now, this is an example from monastic life, but probably all of us here can remember a person in our life, a special person who we've known, who had this kind of quality, where they didn't seem to get shaken by things, or they were a very kind of good person, a very honest person. And then, when those people leave our life, we realize just how special they were, just what an influence they had. So this is something that we can all cultivate, that doesn't require us to be a person who goes down in history. Doesn't require us to be the next Henry Ford, where generations and generations and generations afterwards are going to remember us. It's something where we can be mediocre, but also very, very special. We don't have to have a whole bunch of other people like us or love us or put their praise on us in order to be happy, if we cultivate our life in this way. So this is one of the reasons why the Buddha says the wise person puts aside gains, offerings, and fame, and cultivates solitude instead. It's actually one of the things that I've noticed is being back in Canada and getting really, really busy again, right? Kind of going to one event, then the next event, and then meeting with people, chatting with people, talking with people. It's fun. It's a good thing to do. But if it gets too much, it pulls you away from solitude. It pulls you away from the time that you have with your own mind. And what that does is it makes your meditation worse, actually. It makes you less able to gain happiness just being alone. When you sit down, your mind is all stirred up. Stirred up from talking, stirred up from activity, stirred up from doing all these kind of external things. And if people have trained their mind well, if they're used to being alone, used to practicing alone, it can seem like a bit of a shock. Oh, there's all this activity, all this activity. This is what kind of fame will give us. This is what popularity will give us. This is what being adored by many people will give us. It will give us all this kind of activity, and that activity can be an obstacle to our progress in a type of happiness that only depends on us. So we've all come here today for this same purpose. We've all come here today to search for happiness. We've all come here today so that we can cultivate meditation. And this is because we're all searching for something. We want to be happy. We don't want to suffer. We want these things. And there's a pattern to them. There's a cause and effect relationship to them that we can learn to manipulate. We can learn to develop a skill in. We can learn to develop a skill in goodness. We can learn to develop a skill in peace. And for a person like this, they have a refuge that doesn't have to shake when things external to them go away. That doesn't have to shake if our body gets old, if we get wrinkles on our face. Doesn't have to shake if our kids get sick, if our husband or wife doesn't treat us the way that we think is appropriate. Even if we lose our job. All these things that people put their external weight on. Now, as lay people, you don't have to give all these things up. You can still do them. But if we learn to put some of the weight on ourselves, then at least we have a refuge when these things start to shake. When these things don't go well, we have a safe place. We have a safety. And this is something that has an influence on the people around us. It's something that can inspire the people around us. So not only do we help ourselves, we help others. Not only do we become happy, we help other people to be happy. Just like Venerable Sariputta saw this monk walking along and he thought, surely the path to the deathless has been found. If people cultivate this happiness within themselves, then they can become a source for other people, a refuge for other people, because they've made themselves a refuge. So in this way, becoming a good person has all these various benefits. It's something that benefits ourselves. It's something that makes us happy here and now. And it's something that even at the end of our life makes us not have to worry. So it's worthwhile to put aside gains, offerings, and fame. It's worthwhile to put aside the praise of the world, the blame of the world. It's worthwhile to let it go enough so that we can search inside, so that we can find a happiness that doesn't depend on these things. Because this is something much more stable. And it's what we're looking for. It's the reason why we do everything, to find happiness. Okay? So I think that leave that for reflection. And we'll do some meditation. And after the meditation, if anybody has any questions about that or about Buddhism in general, then you can feel welcome to ask. Okay? So, for meditation, I do a slightly different type of guided meditation. So, what we'll do is what we call anapanasati, breath meditation. One of the things to know about breath meditation is that we think about breath, right? This word breath. In English, breath just means air. It's air that comes into our lungs and goes out. But this Pali word, pana, is actually related to the Sanskrit prana. Has anybody ever heard this word before, prana? So prana actually doesn't mean air, just air. It means a type of energy. So anapanasati is in and out breathing, but it's also an energy. Right? So this is an energy that we can learn to become sensitive to. Now this is not a yoga class where we're going to be learning all about energies. But to meditate well, to do breath meditation well, we have to expand our ideas of what the breath is. If we think that breath just comes in and out of the lungs, that's all we've got to work with, right? But if we think that breath is a type of energy that's through our body, there's a lot more that we can do to relax our body. There's a lot more that we can work with when difficult emotions come up. And there's a lot more that we can do to make our mind comfortable. So one of the things in working with the breath well, and working with the mind well in general, is that it requires us to use imagination. Right? It requires us to think a little bit of outside the box. Actually, what we're just discussing now, kind of being happy, a lot of our happiness or dissatisfaction come from the way that we talk to ourselves about a situation. If we perceive a situation a certain way, it can make us more angry or less angry. Right? It can make us desire some watch more or desire it less, depending how we perceive it. And if we perceive our breath a certain way, it can make it more or less comfortable. So what we're going to learn to do here is to use imagination to imagine that we don't just have to pull the breath in and out of the lungs, but the breath is more like an energy that we can learn to pull in and out of various parts of the body, out of the pores in the skin, out of maybe the center of the head. And this gives us some tools to work with if we have tension in our body. This gives us tools to work with if our breath is becoming too tight, if we're becoming uncomfortable. And what that means is that it gives us tools to work with our mind, right? This kind of connection between the mind and the body. So we can keep this in mind as we go through and do these instructions. If you already have a way to meditate that you're familiar with, if you're already working with a teacher, you can please feel free to go ahead and do that. I'm not trying to force anybody to do the guided meditation. But if you'd like to join in, then I'll do this guided meditation. Okay? So we can lean forward a little bit and arch our spine. And look about 3 feet in front. And close our eyes. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? We have about 7 minutes.
What about passage meditation? Like reciting a line, like not a whole poem or anything, but just a line. Every time you want to stretch the water, you bring it back to that one saying. Sort of like a mantra almost, but you're using a sentence.
There is this type of meditation that they call parikama bhava. So that uses a word. Usually, the simpler the word, the better.
Peace.
Yeah, you can use peace. The thing is, if the mind wanders off and comes back, then what we want to have is a way to make the mind feel happy that it's come back. So if then you want to go to a word like peace on the in-breath, peace on the out-breath, and you find that makes your mind happy and calm, then it might be a skillful way to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in the past, I talked about and me and my wife have been coming for a fair couple of months now.
Okay.
So most teachings of Buddhism were like originally Hindus.
Uh-huh.
Most of these teachings are easy to pick up and resonate.
Uh-huh.
Today is the first time you talked about being an exceptional person, trying to go down that path or seek nirvana.
Uh-huh.
It seemed like it's a difficult sort of choice to make between the two. So I'm of that school of thought that I do want to be an exceptional human, leave a footprint behind for humankind.
Right.
Wouldn't even monks think like nirvana, become an exceptional monk? Like, are these necessarily two different paths?
It's a good question. So there's some people who have made vows in the past. So not just in this life, in past lives, they've made vows, like I want to achieve this. And the achievement of that vow requires people to build up a set of skills. Now these set of skills, they're externally based skills. Like if you want to become somebody very famous, you have to be very bright, you have to be very quick, you sometimes have to be a very excellent speaker, you sometimes also have to be very physically attractive. Like all these people who are very famous world figures, they're sometimes like that. Sometimes they're very, very tall. Like these are all things that sometimes help. So the thing about these two paths going in different directions is that when one comes to practice meditation, then these external things actually become less and less enticing. And actually they can start to seem like an obstacle at times. Now there's a tipping point to this. So at a certain point we're getting happiness from achievement, from developing new skills, from doing outward things, even say like big things, like helping other people, helping a whole country, helping distribute food to a whole country. These are good things. But when we turn our mind inwards to try to find resources of happiness inwards, there becomes this tipping point. Because the potential for happiness looking inwards is much, much, much greater than the potential for looking outwards. So what tends to happen is that if there's a person who has this really great vow, the only thing that keeps them doing that vow in the face of the quest for nirvana is compassion. They have compassion for other beings. That's why they do it. But it's something that takes them away from what's really happy, So the Buddha has said, why do I do this? Because the Tathagata has compassion for other beings. If we have ambition, like we want to leave a mark, we want to do great things, we want people to remember us in history, what we'll find is that this becomes an obstacle to our meditation at some point. At a certain point, it will become an obstacle. These things will be coming up in our head as we meditate. They keep creating patterns of tension in our body. And there'll be a point where our life starts to pull in two directions, right? Where we either have to keep this intention, or we have to decide to develop our meditation further. So at that point, if you choose to develop your meditation further, if somebody really wants to be an exceptional person, what keeps them doing these outward bound things is compassion. As people are suffering, I want to help them. That's what makes somebody really great. But more than that, what makes somebody really great is if they can find a happiness in themselves that doesn't harm anybody. That's probably the best thing that people can do for humanity and for themselves. Maybe time for one more question, if there are any questions. Yeah.
I have like the same point which is expressed. So I started like goals, like I want to become this or that. So I was in that path. Then recently I started this journey. I feel much way better, like feel happy, like peaceful, calm. But now I'm in conflict with my dreams and what I'm doing in a different direction.
Right.
And I'm liking it. So how do I overcome this conflict? Like I want to achieve so many things.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time I want to continue this journey.
Right.
In reality it is like pretty possible to continue everything that
Yeah, so you brought up an important point. So eventually, depending how far one wants to go, it's a choice that everybody has to make. So did you ever see that movie, The Matrix? Says, do you want to take the red pill? You wake up and you believe whatever you want, or you take the blue pill, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Do you remember that scene? That movie was really great. It was a wonderful line. In any event, that movie was based around spirituality, because these themes come up in spirituality. So actually, one of the things that is true about anything that we want to achieve is that it always requires a sacrifice. We're deciding to do this instead of this, right? So you can get benefits from your spiritual practice and live in the lay world. You can be a lay person having goals and wanting to make a mark and doing these things. And it's not necessarily evil, right? If you want to conquer the world, then that's evil. But if you just want to make a mark doing something good, that's not evil. What you'll find is that as you go along, if you start to pursue this path more, there does come this point when it's like a piece of cloth that is pulling in two directions and it's ripping. And there's this point where you look at the cloth and you're like, if I keep pulling on this cloth in this way, it's going to completely tear and be useless. It's very frightening. So the real question that a person has to pose to themselves is, how much do I want to give up to seek a happiness that's true? It doesn't mean that you have to become a monk. But what it means is that if you decide that you fully want to do this, then it's like a person's lay life, whatever there is of their lay life, is not growing. It's kind of everything in your life starts to become more and more for the purpose of developing spiritually. So for some people, because of their strengths and their weaknesses, that means that they'll spend their whole life in the house, right? Maybe they have like a mother to care for, maybe they have obligations and things. But it's like there's something in their mind that's cut. And so eventually those things will wither away. Eventually their spiritual life will grow. But it's a tipping point. And so basically you have to decide. If you decide that you want to do that, then there's a path. But the thing that happens, if you decide that you don't, what tends to happen is that you forget. You forget almost everything, but you forget what you've learned spiritually. It's like it was a dream. You go back to your lay life, one goes back to doing the things that one did, and then the happiness that one had, it's like one can't get it anymore. Even if one does the same thing again. It's because of the intention. And then after a period of time, it's like the whole thing, you kind of forget it. It goes in a haze. So I just tell this one story and then we'll finish up. But when I was a young man, I was a university student. And I was taking business management. And I really liked business. I really liked business management. I really liked university. And I really liked my life, actually. But I was also at the same time doing meditation and these kind of things. And there was this point where I did a retreat. I was doing all these retreats. And after the retreat, there was this thought, the happiness that I'm getting from this is greater than the happiness that I'm getting from my lay life. There was this tipping point. But then I got scared. I was like, wait a minute, am I going crazy? Something's wrong here. This feels like I'm going crazy. So I went back to business school. I was in business school, I just decided to forget everything. And after a few months, it was just like anytime I decided to meditate, the results from a person's spiritual practice at that time were no longer the same. And eventually my day life just got busier and busier. It's like everything I forgot. So actually that little story in the Matrix is a little bit true. With these kind of tipping points, there's a point where we actually have to decide. And depending on what we decide, either we can go forward on this path, or we go back to the way that we did things before and we forget. We forget what it was like. So, unfortunately that's the way it is, right? Okay, so I think we'll leave that for now. and I'll do some chanting to wish everybody well. So this chanting is called Anumodana chanting. And Anumodana means that we rejoice in the goodness of other people. So rejoice in the goodness that people have done today, coming here to cultivate meditation and practice the Dhamma. And this is what this chant is meant to express. So it's also, when monks do this chant, they spread what's called metta, wishing, may all of you be happy and peaceful, and may your goals for spiritual fulfillment be achieved. Okay? So please ignore if my voice cracks. That's the intention behind the chant. I'm not as good of a chanter as Bhante. Bhavatu Sambha Mangalam Rakhantu Sambha Devata Sambha Bhutanu Bhavena Sada Soti Pavantu Te Bhavatu Sambha Mangalam Rakhantu Sambha Devata Sambha Tamanu Bhavena Sada Soti Pavantu Te Bhavatu Sambha Mangalam Rakhantu Sambha Devata Sambha Sankhanu Bhavena Sada Soti Pavantu Te. Very good. So may all of you be well, happy and peaceful, and I hope you have a good week. And Bhante Saranapala will be back again next week.